So to begin with, I want you to go back in your memory and think about a meal that you ate that you really, really enjoyed. It could have been a fancy, expensive restaurant meal, or it might be a meal someone in your family made for you. My grandmother was a really, really incredible cook, and I have lots of memories of when she made food for all of her grandchildren, and we ate it, and wow, she was a good cook. So think for a minute about a meal you've had that you really enjoyed. I'm going to give you a second to pick one. And now I notice some of you have tablets, some have laptops. I think some of you, probably all of you, have a phone. Sounds like I just changed the subject, but I didn't. Your phone might run really quickly or really slowly. Is that more because of the hardware, or is it because of the operating system? The food that you enjoyed, was it that good because the ingredients were the best they could be, or was it the skill of the person who prepared the meal? And as I warned you, I sometimes do, I got ahead of myself and got my visuals out of order. For your phone, does it run as quickly as it does, or as slowly as it does, because of its hardware? Is it years old and you probably need to replace it, or is it brand new and it runs fast? Or is it the operating system? Do you need to update some things? I think probably the answer is both. Really good food comes from really good ingredients, really skillfully prepared. The best ingredients in the world can taste like trash if they're burned or if they're mixed in the wrong amounts. But the best chef, the best cook in the world can't take rotting food and do much more than make it kind of okay. And if you've got a really out-of-date, slow phone, you could put the world's coolest apps on it, it won't have the power to run them. And if you have a really brand new, really powerful phone, but you haven't updated the operating system or put any useful apps on it, it's not going to do you much good. I wanted you to put your attention on those ideas just for a minute, because today we are going to talk about where nonverbals come from. Where do we get all the nonverbal cues that we're going to talk about in the rest of the class? There's an expression in English. I don't know the translation in other languages, but the expression is nature or nurture. Are you who you are because of who your parents were and what you inherited from them? Or are you who you are because of how you were raised and how other people around you influenced you? Your community, your friends, maybe your teachers. In the United States, in the National Basketball Association, LeBron James is widely regarded, if not the best player ever to play the game, one of the best too. And lately he's been talking about, before he retires, he wants to play on a professional team with both of his sons. And they're both good enough that that is a possibility. Are they so good at basketball because he is a gifted athlete and they had him for a father? Or was it because of the way they were raised? My other example, that's Andre Agassi, formerly a professional men's tennis player, arguably one of the top 10 ever to play the game. And that's Stephanie Graf, former professional women's tennis player, very clearly one of the top 2 or 3 ever to play the game. The two of them had 2 children. But both of them have said they did not enjoy their time in tennis. The time they played tennis, they were pretty miserable. They did not encourage their children to play tennis. He plays baseball. She doesn't play a sport. She dances, she models, but she does not really put much of her time into sports at all. So do you become who you are because of genetically what your parents give you, the abilities in your body because of the cells in their body? Or do you become who you are based on the behaviors that you learn from other people? Your parents, sure, but also your neighbors, your friends, and just people in your community. And specifically, where do your nonverbals come from? Now, to take biology for a moment, there are some hard limits to the nonverbal cues we use that are based on the shape of our bodies. We have a lot of gestures that involve using our fingers. We count on our fingers. I have a couple more examples later. Dogs do not use those nonverbals because they don't have any fingers. But I'm not being silly. Dogs have a way to express messages nonverbally that we don't have. They can wag their tail. We can't do that. We don't have a tail. And it's a very simple understanding to think that if a dog is wagging its tail, it means it's happy. That's what people sometimes think. More recently, we've come to understand a dog wagging its tail is excited, but the excitement is not necessarily positive. Dogs that feel threatened, dogs who are about to fight, will often wag their tails. A dog that is very happy but tired, it had a good day playing with you, it's happy, but its tail won't wag because it's not excited. But you shouldn't sell short the influence of culture either. Sometimes people will say to me, when they find out I teach nonverbal communication, and they hear that facial expressions are one way you express messages nonverbally, they'll say, oh, yes, smiles are universal. A smile means the exact same thing everywhere you go in the world. You might have heard that said. It isn't true. It's not even close to true. I'm going to ask the easiest question right now that I will ask all semester. Does everybody on earth speak the same language? No, they don't. I see the beginnings of heads shaking no. No, they don't. But all languages, with the exception of sign language, use vocal cords, tongue, teeth, basically, a few other parts. So if they all use vocal cords, tongue, teeth, and a few other parts, that means they're all the same language, right? No, it doesn't. The same way, people will make that shape with their mouth. That does not mean it means the same thing all over the world. Thailand has the nickname, the land of 1,000 smiles. And this trope, this meme, I suppose it is, made the rounds a few years ago, 13 ways to smile that there's a name for. And if you haven't seen this before or heard about it, and you're curious, the slides will be up after. You can look at them. Or you could just do a Google search for Thailand and 13 ways to smile, and right up it comes. At the other end of the spectrum, here we have 3 astronauts who served together on the International Space Station. You can tell by the flag behind them what country they're from. She's from the United States. He's from Italy. I don't need the flag to tell me he's from Russia. Children in Russia are taught when they're very young. It's rude to smile if other people can't see why you're smiling. If you're smiling and they can't tell why, they may think you're making fun of them. So it's very common that Russians, in perfectly ordinary situations, to people from the United States anyway, look unhappy because the meaning of the smile is completely different. So both biology and culture contribute in a very, very powerful way to where our nonverbals come from. Before I get off this slide, there's one more detail I want to throw in. I'll probably talk about this again the day we talk about facial expression of emotion. But there was a series of studies done back in 2007 that I found really fascinating, and they're a good fit. Well, they're a good fit. Abigail Marsh at Georgetown University. Her working hypothesis was, in the same way, when we talk, you can often tell where we're from by our accent. So I might say, I'm really excited to teach at Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. Or I might say, I'm really excited to teach at Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. Or, I'm really excited to teach at Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. Those are three different accents. You might not be able to place where I'm from, but you could tell I'm from someplace different. Her hypothesis was facial expressions also have accents. Here's what she did. She recruited participants from Japan, born and raised in Japan, and a separate set of participants born and raised in the United States, but with two Japanese parents. And then what she did was she just took pictures of them smiling. Cropped out everything else, hair, clothing, just a picture of them smiling. And then showed those pictures to another group of participants and asked, is this person from Japan or from the United States? And their accuracy in picking which one was very high. There is such thing as a Japanese smile. There is such thing as an American smile. Smiles are not universal. You can even tell by subtleties in how people smile whether they're from your home country. The two more things I'll say before we get into considering biology and culture separately. I started at the beginning talking about the meal that you had and whether it was about the ingredients or the preparation. Because that's one of the best answers I've ever heard to the question, if someone is very talented, is that natural or is it hard work? Is it nature or is it nurture? And the answer is, well, what is a really good loaf of bread? Is it the ingredients or is it the preparation? And the answer is, it's both. When it comes to your phone, your tablet, your laptop, one of the leading researchers of intercultural communication, a man named Kurt Hofstede, he defines culture very simply. He says culture is your operating system. Culture is your software. When you were born, you were hardware. The whole process of raising you from a newborn to an adult. In English, the term is enculturation, E-N, enculturation. That's just installing your operating system. So what I want to do, I want to give a little bit of an overview of the influence of biology and a little bit of an overview of the influence of culture. And that's going to take the rest of our time today. Every unit we come to from now on, starting next week when we do nonverbals of appearance, we will pause occasionally and say, this is primarily biology. Or we will say, now for this, there are a lot of variants that have to do with culture. There are two researchers, nonverbal communication researchers, who have theories of the biological influence that I want to start off by sharing with you. There's one named Martin Remland, and Martin Remland divides all nonverbal cues into 3 categories: symptoms, pictures, and symbols. Symptoms, pictures, and symbols. Symptoms refers to things that your body does that you do not control, that other people can observe. The term is borrowed from medicine. How can you tell you're getting sick? If you have a fever, that's a symptom. Some symptoms people observe and draw conclusions about you. A lot of the nonverbals that tell other people how old you are, Remland would call symptoms. As you get to where you're old, your hair might turn gray, your skin might wrinkle. When you're very young, you're shorter, your build might be more slender. When you're a teenager, depending on what part of the world you're from and what diet you eat, you might have pimples. When your voice begins to change, it might break. These are not things that you control, but they show how old you are. Some of your emotional cues would be symptoms. Sometimes, if something startles you, something happens suddenly and it's very scary, you might shake. That's because you have fight or flight chemicals in your bloodstream: epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol. You're not in control of it. It's a physical symptom. But if you see someone and they're shaking, you can tell, you have a good guess what emotion they are experiencing. Is there anything you can tell about this man from the picture on the right? He's had a few to drink, and he now has the flush. And the flush is a symptom. It is not something he's in control of. So that first category, if you can say, I could tell that this was happening to them because I saw they changed color, they were shaking, they had gray hair, all of those in Remland's categories, those are all symptoms. His second category, second and third, I'm going to go through a lot more quickly. Some of them are pictures. Some of the nonverbal cues, some of the nonverbal messages we send to other people, we are making a picture of what we're talking about. Think about what that gesture means. That gesture means money. It means that whatever you're talking about, someone spent money on it. And if you think about what a 5 yen coin and a 50 yen coin have in common, that's the explanation I've seen most often for what that gesture means. That's showing a coin. The comparable gesture that I see in the United States looks like this, which is holding currency, bills in your hand and fanning them. In each case, you're showing a picture of what you're talking about. Now, there are a few other examples, easy examples of pictures. If you wear makeup, that's a picture of a person who's very healthy. If you are talking to, well, actually not talking, you might suggest to somebody, hey, let's go eat, just by miming the shape of eating. Or, do you want something to drink, by miming the movement of drinking. Back when I knew more people who would smoke cigarettes, they would often suggest a smoke break to their friends by miming smoking. All of those are pictures. If you're eating in a restaurant and the waiter or server comes over and reaches for your plate but stops, so that you can, if you're done eating, hand it to them. That's a picture. We call that an intention movement. It shows you what they're about to do, but they don't complete it. They just show it to you. If you had a piece of paper and you had written down on it all the reasons you think I'm a terrible person, and you said, if I give this to you, what will you do with it? And I said, that would be an intention movement. It'd show you what I'm going to do, and that would be a picture. Third and finally, there are symbols. Symbols are nonverbals that we send. We send them routinely. Other people know what they mean, but they're not pictures. I'm teaching at Tsuda University in Kodaira. I've been teaching an argumentation and debate class. It's almost over, so yesterday I asked the students if we could take a class picture. Not everybody wanted to be in the picture, which was okay, but several did. Here it is. And what nonverbal do you see from just about all of them? And what in the world does it mean? There are a few explanations. I've heard the story that years ago, I believe a figure skater came to Japan, showed that in all of her pictures, and she was popular, and other people started doing it. I've also heard it explained as it's just a way of showing the photographer you're ready for them to take it. But the fact is, you'll see that a lot when people are posing for a picture. The nonverbal is not meant to be like a coin or an intention gesture. The meaning it has because we decided it means that. So that is why Martin Remlin would call it a symbol. I spent more time on the first of the three, symptoms, because in Remlin's theory of nonverbals, all symptoms are biological. The interpretation of them might have a little to do with culture. For example, I showed you someone turning a little red and said that's someone who had been drinking. In the United States, they're a little bit less likely to turn red when they've been drinking. That might not be the first interpretation if you see someone blush. You might instead think they were embarrassed. You might think they were getting angry. And it might depend on how light or dark their skin was, because people with darker skin, when they blush, it's a little harder to see. And therefore, people don't pick it up as readily. But for the most part, symptoms are almost entirely biologically determined. Pictures, they draw from the actual world. So if someone gestures like this to say, hey, let's go smoke, they're actually not inventing something out of pure creativity. Symbols, on the other hand, are entirely made up. They're entirely about culture. We decided this nonverbal means this, so that's what it means. All right. One more glance at that. That was Martin Remlin. Researcher number 2, who has an explanation for the biology of nonverbals, is a man named Ross Buck. Ross Buck. Ross Buck is chiefly concerned with emotions. He has a framework for explaining emotions. It's really simple. He labels it emotion 1, emotion 2, emotion 3. 1, 2, and 3. For our purposes, we're mostly going to talk about emotion 2. But I'm going to explain 1 and 3 to you, because without them, you can't really understand what's going on. Emotion 1, according to Ross Buck, are systems inside your body. Your endocrine system, meaning your various glands that control your metabolism and a lot of your body function. Your autonomic system, your heartbeat, your breathing. your sleep cycle, things you don't control, and your immune system. Now, emotion 1, according to Ross Buck, is measurable if you have specialized equipment. Doctors can tell whether your hormones are operating properly, but they have to do a blood draw to do it. They can tell whether you're breathing, whether your heart is beating the right way, but they need a stethoscope or maybe even an X-ray. People just looking at you can't necessarily tell what's happening with emotion 1. Emotion 2, according to Ross Buck, consists of displays that other people can observe. Emotion 1 gives you physical sensations. If there's a loud noise, your adrenal glands, which are on the top of your kidneys right about here, they will dump those chemicals I named a few minutes ago, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol into your bloodstream. Now, if a doctor did a blood draw, they could tell that that was in your bloodstream. That's emotion 1. But then emotion 2, when you're full of fight or flight, you do this, and other people can see it. The fact that this child is crying, that belongs in emotion 2. That's observable. Inside her body, emotion 1 is changing the operation of her organs and the chemical composition of her blood. Interestingly, and this is a fairly recent discovery, there are 3 different kinds of tears. Speaking of tears, this is a picture that I show my students back in the United States because I've always found it entertaining. They find it disturbing. But there are 3 different kinds of tears. There are the tears your eyes make when you blink. They make them all day. Every time you blink, your eyes are lubricated with tears. There are irritation tears. When you chop onions, tears are released, but they're a different chemical composition. And then there are the tears you make when you cry. Those are the most different of all. They have a number of different waste products from stress hormones in them, which is why, commonly, if you're very upset and you cry, you feel better afterward. Because your body has purged some of those stress chemicals. The third part of this system, oh, wait a minute. I almost stopped talking about emotion 2, and that would have been bad. Because Buck divides emotion 2 into 2 subsets, 2 smaller categories. Close up and far away. Close up and far away. You can observe people's emotional state if you hear their voice, but you're better positioned to tell their emotion if you're close to them. You can tell someone's emotional state from their muscle tone, whether they're tense. If they're tense, they may be angry. Shaking could be fear. Slack could be exhausted, burned out. You can tell people's emotions, and this research I've always found fascinating, from how they smell. You can collect t-shirts worn by people who have been experimentally given a very startling, scary stimulus. You show them a big tarantula. You show them something that's scary. Then you let other people get a smell of the t-shirt that they wore. As compared to a t-shirt worn by someone else who just exercised, we can smell fear. Fear changes people's smell. That would be an example of emotion 2 that was in the close-up system. The other system is far away, distance signals. The distance signals include your face, and there are a lot of researchers who say our face and our brain's response to faces has been optimized so at a distance we can tell other people's emotions. We can see if they're threatening. We can see if they're welcoming. We have whites around our eyes that are bigger than most other animals because that gives us more cue as to what people are doing with their eyes. If they're looking at us, if their eyes are wide, if their eyes are tense and clenched, all of that we can see at a distance. Buck also includes posture. It's related to muscle tone. It sends similar messages. So if you're upright, if you're really upright, you might be having a negative emotion, ready to fight, or you might be afraid. If you're slouching, you may be sad. You may have low-grade debilitating emotions. And then finally, Buck says, how far you stand from other people, how you space yourself out. If you're in a group, and the group knows one another and gets together to socialize, and you stand off by yourself, that sends a message about your emotional state, and it can be observed from a distance. One other thing he says about emotion, too. He says the close-range cues tend to be biological and cross-cultural. They tend to be innate. We don't control them. We don't have to be taught them. And they tend to be the same everywhere you go. The faraway cues, the distance cues, are more likely to be things we learn from other people, and they're more likely to be very culturally variant. If you travel around the world, you will discover in different parts of the world how close you get to other people. The polite distance to be from other people changes a lot. The United States used to be classified, I'm getting ahead of myself, but I'll repeat it when I get there. The United States used to be classified as a low or non-contact culture. We were therefore, people from the United States tended to be more comfortable if you stayed a little further away. But there's been a lot of immigration from Central and South America, where they are higher contact cultures. And I have over the years known a lot of American college students who would do study abroad in Chile, in Argentina, Guatemala, Mexico. And one of their earliest experiences is everybody they meet walks right up to within an inch of them to have a conversation. Because the personal space bubble is something very culturally variant. Okay. So the way Remlin categorizes nonverbals... Oh, I didn't talk about emotion 3. Emotion 3. According to Ross Buck, emotion 3 is your subjective internal experience of the feeling. How it feels to you to have the emotion. Now, emotion 1 could be observed, but only by a doctor with equipment. Emotion 2 could be observed by anybody. And other people respond to us based on emotion 2. And Buck's theory says, from our experience of emotion 1, how we physically feel, and from emotion 2, how other people treat us based on what they observe, that's how we arrive at emotion 3. So you might discover things that you were looking forward to weren't going to happen, or something that was very important to you, someone else broke. And you experience a lot of sensations. Your body responds to you finding that out. Other people observing you see that you look angry. But as for emotion 3, it depends on how other people treat you when you get angry, which is very different around the world. In some places, you may be encouraged. Speak up. Say why you're angry. Yell about it, you'll feel better after. Other places, you might be made to feel ashamed. You shouldn't feel angry. That's not how to treat other people. All of that shapes emotion 3. You have the sensations, you show the outer signs, people respond to those outer displays. You then, inside of you, experience subjectively the emotion. I have an older brother. When we were both little, he loved to go to amusement parks and go on roller coasters. I think you could call him an adrenaline junkie. He loved to feel scared. He loved to watch horror movies. I hated feeling scared. Wouldn't get on roller coasters. Would not watch horror movies. I did not learn to swim until I was 12 because I hated feeling scared. Now, every time you feel afraid, there are changes in the balance of chemicals in your body. You show that feeling of fear. Other people respond to it, but then you get to the subjective inner experience of it. And for my brother, raised in the same neighborhood, in the same house by the same parents, his emotion 3 for fear went one direction. Mine went the opposite direction. So Buck's framework goes partway toward explaining the biological roots of nonverbals. Emotion 1 is the biological end of our emotional displays. So this time I'm pretty sure that I am done with the theoretical framework. Let us get on to talking about, very briefly, because we will come back to these, 4 different nonverbal channels that are very, very influenced by biology. We tend to be suspicious that a nonverbal channel is mostly biology, when no matter where we go around the world, it's very similar. Now, it's never identical, but it's very similar. A major topic next week is going to be attractiveness. What is it that makes a face attractive? One of the qualities that makes a face attractive, there's a Greek word for it, koinophilia, but the simpler word for it is to say average. If you take all the faces in a community and make a composite photograph, you overlay all of them to where you see the average face, something fascinating happens. The more faces you add, the prettier the features become. There's a website you can go and play with. I might put a link to it in Moodle. I believe it's just called faceresearch.org or .net, but don't go look at it yet. I'll find it for you. And it's got several dozen individual pictures, and you can go through and click the ones you want. And the exercise is, pick about 5 of them and make the composite. Then pick about 20 and make the composite. Then pick all of them. And each time, that face will get better and better looking. The explanation for why we tend to find features attractive if they're very average is a healthy person who has no congenital defects is someone who's going to make a more attractive romantic partner. If you and that person make a baby together, it's going to be a healthy baby. So we have wired into us to be attracted to people whose bodies followed the blueprint of their DNA with no mistakes. And that's very consistent around the world. A second area in which biology seems to be a big deal is facial expression. I think this has been brought up at every meeting of this class so far. We will get to the controversy over whether there are such things as basic emotions. We do know that there's a lot of similarity, not perfect similarity, but a lot of similarity around the world. I mentioned smiling before. We know that babies who are blind from birth will smile when they're only a few days old, which tells you they didn't learn it because they can't see anybody. It wasn't taught to them because they're too young to understand language. They do it spontaneously. There are some theories that some of these recognizable expressions, surprise and fear, people all around the world open their eyes wider when they're surprised. They open their eyes wider or tend to when they're afraid. And the theory is that's a reflex that protects us. The wider you open your eyes, the more you can see. There is a theory that an angry look, I believe that's anger, that an angry look, we are wired to recognize other people's threat displays. We therefore, when we are angry, and babies will make angry faces from a very young age, we do it consistently because if sender and receiver both get the message, then everybody is a little bit safer. You can stay away from someone who has a threat display. The third nonverbal channel that we think has a lot to do with biology is touch. Babies have to be touched or they will sicken and die. There have been a lot of experiments, heartbreaking, sad experiments with this over the years. If you really want to read some history that will ruin your day, go back and read about the orphanages in Romania in, I want to say the 1980s, it might be the 1990s. The dictator at the time, Nicolae Ceausescu, he was ruling over a country where the majority of the population was Catholic. And he, because he thought it would make the country wealthier and more powerful, he encouraged everybody to have lots and lots of children. The problem is the program spun out of control, and a lot of the children wound up in orphanages. And these orphanages were so big and so overcrowded that a lot of the babies every day would just lie in a crib all day and not be touched. They'd be fed, they'd have their diapers changed, but 22 hours a day, no human contact. And they wound up a mess. Many of the babies got sick and died, and the ones who lived wound up with serious emotional problems. What we know happens when you touch other people, when other people touch you. I meant to put this on the slide, but it slipped my mind. Your body releases a substance we call oxytocin. It is both a hormone and a neurotransmitter. So it regulates the functions of your organs, but it also regulates neural activity. You can inject lab rats with oxytocin, and they will relax and welcome stranger rats that they've never seen or smelled before. You can inject lab rats with oxytocin, and then put in rat pups, newborn rats that are not theirs. They will take care of them, lie down on their side, and prepare to nurse them, even though they can't nurse them. They don't have the milk flowing. They do all that just because of what that substance does. Human beings, when releasing oxytocin buffers, it lowers your stress response. It tends to make you more welcoming of other people. It makes you sleep better. And what releases oxytocin naturally in your body is touch. Now, not a moment's touch. If someone bumps you in the subway or in the train, you don't release oxytocin. But touch that has a pattern to it, someone rubbing your shoulders, someone patting you, where there's something meaningful, your body will release oxytocin. And that, there are entire careers being made out of trying to explain the release of oxytocin, the influence that has on how we build relationships with other people. We welcome other people, including strangers, when we are releasing oxytocin. So, touch as a channel of nonverbal communication. One biological factor that really amplifies the effect it has when you touch when you are touched by someone you know, you release oxytocin and it changes how you behave toward other people, in addition to changing how you feel. Fourth and final example, my favorite of all the biological ones, and it tends to be the student's favorite as well. That visual is of a complex of genes. The technical term in English is the major histocompatibility complex. That'll be on the slides later if you want to. Don't worry about copying it down now. I've also found articles on it translated into Japanese consistently translate the term like that. So I think that is actually a fair Japanese translation of major histocompatibility complex. Now, I'm not an immunologist, but here's my simple explanation of what this is and the nonverbal associated with it. This complex of genes, it influences the chemistry of your immune system, and in particular, what your immune cells will respond to. If I gave you more details than that, I would quickly get beyond what I understand. But people have different major histocompatibility complexes. Babies are healthiest if mother and father have very, very different MHCs. So if yours and the person you make a baby with, if they're very different, that baby's going to have a strong immune system. Its immune system will challenge more possible invaders. What does this have to do with nonverbal communication? Well, a fascinating study done in 1997 and replicated 2 years later found you take t-shirts people have sweated into, you hand them off to someone of the opposite sex. You give the participant in the study 10 t-shirts to smell, and you say, rank them in order. Which one smelled terrible? Which one smelled pretty good? The one that smelled good, and by the way, blood draws were done with both the participants and the people who wore the t-shirts. You could reliably tell the one they thought smelled good, the major histocompatibility complex was the most different. People smell good to you when their MHC is different. And if you're attracted to how they smell, then you and that person would make a healthier baby. The replication done in 1999 found that if you showed people, let's say you had them smell the 10 t-shirts, and then you showed them the photos of the 10 people who'd provided the t-shirts, but you don't tell them which t-shirt went with which photo. And you ask for the photos, which face is the most attractive? They didn't do it all the time, but a whole lot of the time, they picked the most attractive t-shirt and said the face was the most attractive, and it was the same person. And for women participating in the study, if they were ovulating, they were even more likely to find that person attractive and to say their face was attractive. So smell is a way that we communicate non-verbally, and it has a very big biological component to it. So that is our quick look at the biological roots of nonverbals. With the balance of our time, we're going to take a quick look at the cultural roots of nonverbals. And we will come back to this repeatedly in weeks to come. In the study of cross-cultural research, and in particular in intercultural communication research, there are ways we categorize cultures. For some of you, this may be very old review. Please be patient with me if it is. Maybe I'll give you a different illustration than you've heard before. For some of you, it may not be. I have no way of knowing. But these 5, we call them cultural value dimensions. There are far more than 5, but I've picked 5 that tend to show up, tend to shape people's nonverbals. The first of the 5 is individual versus collective. Individual versus collective. The United States is a very individualist culture. Japan is a very collectivist culture. Where that shapes nonverbal communication, primarily it shows up in how freely you express emotion. The more individualist a culture is, the more people are taught from a very young age, say how you feel, show how you feel. If you need to cry, cry. Sad or upset or just having a terrible day and you need to break down and cry, go ahead and cry. If you're angry, out with it. Say you're angry. Yell if you need to. Let's get it out on the table and deal with it. If you're afraid, admit to being afraid. Those are emotional intelligence components in individualist cultures. In collectivist cultures, the norm from young childhood more commonly is your negative emotions may upset other people. Deal with your emotions behind closed doors. Do it in private. But don't burden other people with a display of your emotions. They might be uncomfortable. Now that principle has huge implications, sends a lot of ripples through how we show nonverbals and how we interpret nonverbals. The second, contact, non-contact. This one I mentioned a few minutes ago in saying the United States used to be categorized non-contact. The United States is now categorized as moderately contact because, or the best explanation we think we have, so many people have moved in from Central and South America, which tends to have contact cultures, that now in the United States, the simplest way to see it is when I was a young child, the only people you would hug would be members of your own family. Today, you can hug friends. I know coworkers, people who have nothing in common other than they work together, but they hug. It's not that uncommon to see strangers hug each other. And when I was a child, 50 years ago, that would have been bizarre. So cultures may be contact or non-contact. Some of the most fascinating research into this focuses on Japan, which is categorized as a distinctly non-contact culture. Often the discussion begins with the discussion of bowing. A lot of other parts of the world, the greeting ritual involves touching someone. Shaking hands involves touching. Bowing does not. And bowing like this, you need a little more space. You need to be far enough apart that you don't bump heads. I tend to be skeptical of consultants, of people who write books about nonverbals. I talked about it at the first class meeting when we were talking about hogwash. But I stumbled upon one who I think made a good point about contact and non-contact in Japan. The two things he had going for him were, first of all, he's from Japan, his name is Matsumoto, and secondly, he wrote on a number of other topics and he got a lot of facts right. Here's what he said about contact, non-contact in Japan, which I had found puzzling. He said, on the train, when the train's really crowded, and you see so many people reading books, playing on their phones, even sitting back sound asleep, what they are doing, he said, psychologically, is being a non-contact culture. Because if you can keep eye contact broken to where you don't interact with any of the people around you, then the crowding is not as uncomfortable. And he said, and I don't know if this is true, I've only been here about 7 weeks, he said most of the people you see on the train with their eyes shut, they're not asleep. They're just shutting out the world. They're pretending to be asleep. They just don't want to be in a crowd that big. And closing your eyes is a way to make a little space for yourself. One bit of research I'll cite. 2007 study by a researcher named Miles Patterson. He did this in the United States and in Japan. As a matter of fact, it was in St. Louis and in Tokyo. He sent his graduate students out with a simple instruction. Walk through a busy part of town. Every time you see someone, look them right in the eye, smile and nod. And what he found was in St. Louis, when they did this, 1 out of every 4 people smiled back and usually said hello. In Tokyo, 2%, 1 out of every 50 even made eye contact. In high contact cultures, greeting someone who's a stranger is something you do if you feel like it. You heard me say at the first class meeting, I grew up in Texas. I'm not making this up. In Texas, when you drive on the highway outside the city, Texans will wave at other cars. Now, there's no way they have any idea who that is, but they do it all the time. And I've had friends of mine from outside Texas take a road trip with me and say, that's the stupidest thing I've ever seen. Well, maybe, but we're friendly. So contact, non-contact, very culturally variant, and we will hear more about it when it comes to how it shapes nonverbals. Third, power distance. Power distance, the concept of power distance. If cultures are high power distance, it means some people are more powerful, other people are less powerful. Everyone admits it. Everyone talks about it openly. In a low power distance culture, there are still people who are more powerful and less powerful, but nobody wants to admit it, and they won't talk about it openly. In low power distance cultures, the myth, the narrative tends to be, we're all equal, nobody's better than anybody else. Now I use this as my visual, because you do have an emperor and an empress, and there's a lot that goes on in understanding everyday life in Japan that is about rank. Who's above, who's below, who's senior, who's junior. That's a very high power distance quality. But interestingly, cross-cultural researchers have a hard time with Japan because it's actually, Japan has less difference in income between the wealthiest and the least wealthy than most other wealthy nations. The owner of a company probably does not make that much more than the person hired yesterday at the bottom of the organization compared to the United States or even Europe. And that is the kind of thing you're more likely to see in a low power distance culture. It's also fairly common here for the owner of the company to dress in the same uniform that the workers are expected to wear. You would never see that in the United States. So that's power distance. What does it have to do with nonverbals? Well, people who are higher up in a high power distance culture have more freedom to show any kind of display, including negative ones, to people who are lower. With their peers, if a company owner talks to another company owner, if a mayor of a city talks to another mayor, they will be very polite and they will maintain a good appearance. But when you talk to someone who's clearly lower, you don't have to stick to that. People who are lower, communicating with people higher in power, show only positive emotions and will read the situation to try to make the more powerful person comfortable. In low power distance cultures, what's a lot more common, you use your nonverbals to try to erase any difference. You use your nonverbals to try to show that you're the same. So in a low power distance culture, if you're very, very wealthy, you will dress as though you're not, because you don't want to look different from your neighbor. The fourth difference, direct or indirect. Direct or indirect. Researchers will sometimes call it high context or low context. High context or low context. That's my visual, because in indirect cultures, and Japan is categorized as one, you're expected to read communication for clues. People will give you clues of what their real message is, and if you're a good communicator, you can read the air. In direct, if a culture is direct, communicators are expected to come right out and say what they mean. And there will be a lot of language about don't play games, don't be childish, just say what you mean, use your words. And a competent communicator always says what they mean. In an indirect culture, a competent communicator is a good observer and notices what's really being said. So how does this influence nonverbal communication? A couple of things. A big one has to do with when you have to tell someone no. If you have to tell someone no, if you have to give them an answer they don't like, people whose culture is direct, their communication pattern will be just to come right out and say it. You may have remembered that I said at the first class meeting, I got in trouble at my university in the United States because I was hurting people's feelings. That's because, one of the reasons, when I taught class, students would ask a question, well, what if? Is this true? Could this be true? And I would just say, no. And they were startled. No, that's it, no. And I had to learn to be a little more gentle when they floated a possibility, when they had an idea, because come right out and say it. But in indirect cultures, that would be very difficult. That's a little... You do a lot with your nonverbals to let people down easily and to let them know the answer is really no, but I'm not going to come out and say it because that would be rude. It's also the case in indirect cultures, children are taught from a very young age, you can tell how people are getting along with one another if you're observant. You can tell if you move into a new situation, who's the powerful one? Who does everyone look at? Where are people seated in a room? People in direct communication cultures don't learn any of that. They figure if you want to know who's powerful, you look at the organization chart. You find out who's the boss. And if people are not making the powerful one the boss, they don't know how to put an organization together. So the difference, as this particular cultural trait shapes nonverbals, are the nonverbals a clue to what's really happening, or are the nonverbals confirming what should be obvious? Fifth and finally, some cultures are categorized as competitive, some cultures are categorized as cooperative. The old term for this, I mentioned Kurt Hofstede a little while ago. When he started his research, he didn't use competitive and cooperative. He used masculine and feminine. Researchers today have abandoned that. There's a lot of sexism built into that. The idea that men are the competitive ones and women are the cooperative ones. So today we say competitive and cooperative. In competitive cultures, an aggressive display is more accepted. And in competitive cultures, and this is part of the reason Hofstede chose to call them masculine cultures, it tends to be that the gender roles are more strict and they're more enforced. A lot of countries in Europe along the Mediterranean, Spain, Italy, Greece, and much of Central and South America, very competitive cultures. The expectation is, in a business, the man will be in charge, and the man's wife will stay home and raise the kids. In Northern Europe, Scandinavia,